Hey, so tonight we're going to talk about what happened after the Black Death ended, and trust me, this isn't your typical history lesson. We're talking about one of the most dramatic transformations in human history, when Europe literally had to rebuild itself from the ground up. Oh, and if you're enjoying these stories, I'd really appreciate a like or subscribe. Super curious where you're all listening from, so drop a comment with your location and what time it is there. Always blows my mind how people are falling asleep to this all over the world. Alright, find that cozy spot, take a nice slow breath, and just let your body sink into whatever you're lying on. We're heading back to 1453, and trust me, you're going to be real grateful for that mattress by the time we're done. So, congratulations! You just woke up in England, 35 years after the Black Death swept through Europe like nothing anyone had ever seen before. The good news? You survived. The bad news? Well, let's just say the world you knew is gone. You open your eyes, and the first thing that hits you isn't what you see, it's what you don't hear. No morning bustle from the village square, no children playing in the streets, no hammering from the blacksmith's shop, just silence. That heavy, unnatural quiet that settles over places where too many people used to live. Your muscles ache as you stretch, that deep tiredness that comes from working harder than your body wants to. But these days, everyone who's left works harder than they should. There's no choice. You roll over, feeling the rough straw mattress beneath you. At least you have a mattress now. Before the plague, serfs like you slept on bare ground with maybe some rags for warmth. But now, well, when half the population dies, suddenly there's a lot more stuff to go around. Strange how that works, isn't it? You sit up slowly, letting your eyes adjust to the dim light filtering through the one small window. The house itself is bigger than what you grew up in. Used to belong to the miller and his family. All 6 of them died in the space of a week, back in 1348. Their bodies were buried in the churchyard. Along with so many others, they had to dig mass graves. These days, you try not to think about that too much. The floorboards creak under your feet, actual wooden floors, not just packed dirt. You inherited more than just a house when the plague finished its work. There's a chest in the corner with clothes that actually fit, a proper cooking pot hanging over the fireplace, even a pewter cup, which used to be something only wealthy merchants could afford. Funny thing about catastrophes, they have a way of redistributing wealth, just not in any way you'd ever want. You pull on your tunic, wool, instead of the rough hemp you wore before. It's a good feeling, warm against your skin, but there's always that little voice in the back of your head reminding you that this tunic used to belong to someone who died choking on their own blood. You try not to think about that either. Outside, your breath makes little clouds in the morning air. September in England has always been cold, but somehow it feels colder now. Maybe it's just because there are fewer people to warm the world with their presence. Or maybe, when you've seen as much death as everyone has, everything feels a little colder. The village of Little Wickham looks like a mouth with half its teeth knocked out. Houses stand empty, their doors hanging open like slack jaws, gardens grown wild, fences falling down. In the distance, you can see fields that should be golden with grain, but instead they're brown and barren. No one left to harvest them. Before the plague, this village had maybe 200 people. Now, maybe 60 on a good day. Your stomach growls, sharp and insistent. That's the thing they don't tell you about surviving disasters. You still get hungry. Life goes on, even when it feels like it shouldn't. You walk toward the village centre, past the well where people used to gather and gossip. The wooden bucket hangs there, rope frayed and water level low. Maintenance is, well, everything's about maintenance now. There just aren't enough hands to keep things running the way they used to. The baker's shop is still closed, has been for 3 years now. Thomas the baker died, along with his wife and 2 sons. His apprentice tried to keep things going for a while, but bread making isn't something you just pick up. The few loaves he managed to make were... let's just say they were dense enough to use as building materials. These days, people bake their own bread, or try to. Turns out, a lot of knowledge died with the plague. All those little skills that people pass down from parent to child, gone, just gone. You can smell wood smoke drifting from the direction of the manor house. Lord Edmund's place. He survived, though just barely, lost his wife, his 3 children, most of his household staff. Now it's just him, his remaining steward, and maybe a dozen servants, where there used to be 50. Poor bastard actually has to do some of his own work now. Can you imagine? But here's where things get interesting, and this is the part that would have been unthinkable before the plague. You're not going to bow and scrape when you see him. You're not going to tug your forelock and mumble, "Yes, my lord," and "No, my lord," like your father did. Because Lord Edmund needs you, more than you need him. See, when half the population dies, suddenly the people who are left become very, very valuable. Supply and demand, medieval style. Your feet crunch on the frost-covered grass as you make your way toward the manor. Today's the day you're going to ask for more money. 3 months ago, you would have been whipped for even thinking such a thing, but 3 months ago, Lord Edmund had other options. He doesn't anymore. The manor house looms ahead. Stone walls that used to seem so imposing, now they just look like expensive walls around an increasingly empty house. Most of the windows are shuttered. No point heating rooms nobody uses. You rap on the heavy wooden door. 3 sharp knocks that echo in the morning stillness. Footsteps approach, slow and measured. The steward opens the door. Richard, a man who used to have 3 assistants, now he does everything himself. "Morning, Thomas," he says. His voice carries that particular weariness that everyone has now. The exhaustion of people trying to do too much with too little. "Morning, Richard. Need to speak with his lordship." Richard raises an eyebrow. "Before the plague..." Peasants didn't just demand audiences with lords, but these aren't before the plague times. "He's in the solar. I'll let him know you're here." You wait in the great hall, and even here you can see how much has changed. The tapestries are dusty. There's no one left to maintain them properly. The long tables where dozens of people used to eat, most of them pushed against the walls and covered with cloth. Lord Edmund appears at the top of the stairs. He's smaller than you remember, thinner. The plague didn't kill him, but it aged him 20 years in 5. His clothes are fine, but they hang loose on his frame. Even the rich don't eat as well as they used to. "Thomas," he says, coming down the stairs with careful dignity. "Richard says you wanted to speak with me." "Aye, my lord, about my wages." The words hang in the air between you. A year ago, hell, 6 months ago, this conversation would have ended with you in the stocks. But Lord Edmund just sighs, like a man who's had this conversation too many times already. "What are you making now? 2 shillings a week?" "Aye, but John over in Great Wickham, he's getting 3 shillings for the same work, and they're throwing in an extra measure of grain." Lord Edmund's jaw tightens. John's always been... He stops himself, takes a breath. "What exactly are you asking for?" 3 shillings, and I want Sundays off, proper off, not just morning service and then back to work. The old Lord Edmund would have exploded, called the guards, had you beaten. But the old Lord Edmund had 50 workers to choose from. This Lord Edmund has you, and maybe 5 others. He looks out the window at his fields, brown stubble where golden grain should be waving, fields that need to be ploughed for winter wheat, work that has to be done, and not enough people to do it. 2 shillings and 6 pence, he says finally, and Sunday afternoons off. You pretend to consider this, though honestly, it's more than you hoped for, but you've learned something important in these past few years. When someone needs you more than you need them, you have power. Done, you say, extending your hand. He shakes it, a lord, shaking hands with a peasant. Your grandfather would have fainted. As you walk back through the village, you pass the churchyard. The original cemetery was full by the time the plague finished, so they dug new sections, then those filled up. Now there are graves scattered around the church like fallen leaves, but life, somehow, keeps going. You see Margaret hanging laundry behind her cottage. She's wearing a dress that's too fine for a widow, but her husband had been the village's most successful merchant before he died. Now she owns his business, such as it is. Women inheriting property, running their own shops. Another thing that would have been impossible before. Strange how catastrophe creates opportunities. She waves at you, and you wave back. Maybe later, when the work's done, you'll stop by, share some ale, talk about how things used to be, and maybe, if you're both in the right mood, you'll talk about how things might be, because that's the thing nobody tells you about surviving disasters. Eventually, you start thinking about the future again. Your stomach rumbles once more, reminding you that survival still requires the basics: food, shelter, work. But as you head toward your own fields, the ones you're renting now that you can afford it, you're thinking about more than just getting by. You're thinking about getting ahead. The walk to your fields takes you past the old grain mill. The wheel still turns, but slowly. There's not enough grain to keep it busy. Before the plague, this mill ran from dawn to dusk during harvest season. No, maybe 2 or 3 hours a day. Ooh. But that's changing too, slowly, because the people who survived, they're eating better, working less, demanding more. And when people have more money in their pockets, they buy more grain, more meat, more of everything. It's like watching a broken machine slowly start to work again. But differently. Better, in some ways. Your fields stretch out before you. Not huge, but yours. Well, rented, but at terms that your father never could have imagined. Lord Edmund was so desperate for someone to work this land that he agreed to let you keep 60% of what you grow. Before the plague, a peasant might keep 20% if he was lucky. The soil is dark and rich, ready for winter planting. You run it through your fingers, feeling the potential there. This land could feed a family, with enough left over to sell at market, maybe even enough to buy that piece of property down by the river that's been sitting empty since the Hartwell family died. Because here's what nobody expected when the plague finished killing people. It left behind a world with abundant land and scarce workers. And for the first time in centuries, that meant ordinary people had choices. You spend the morning breaking ground for winter wheat, the wooden plough cutting clean furrows in the earth. It's good work, honest work, but it's also chosen work. You're here because you want to be, not because some lord commanded it. That makes all the difference. Around midday, you stop for bread and ale. The bread's your own, made from grain you grew yourself. It's dense, a little burned on one side, but it's yours, and that makes it taste better than any bread some baker ever made. As you eat, you watch smoke rising from chimneys around the village. Fewer chimneys than before, but the ones that are lit burn brighter. People heat their homes better now, eat heartier meals, wear warmer clothes. The plague took everything, but it also left everything behind. For the survivors, You finish your meal and get back to work. The afternoon sun is warm on your shoulders as you guide the plough through another furrow. In the distance, you can hear Margaret's children playing. They're some of the few children left in the village, and their laughter carries farther now that there's less noise to compete with. It's a lonely sound, but not entirely sad, because those children, they're growing up in a world where a peasant can negotiate with a lord, where a widow can run a business, where someone born in a one-room hovel can end up farming their own fields. That's worth something, isn't it? As the sun starts to sink toward the horizon, you clean your tools and head home to a house that's bigger than where you grew up, home to a supper that'll be better than what your parents ever ate, home to a life that while born from tragedy, is undeniably better than what came before. Tomorrow, you'll plant more wheat. Next week, you'll probably have another conversation with Lord Edmund about wages or working conditions. Next month, maybe you'll make an offer on that property by the river. Because the world ended, and then it began again. Different, smaller in some ways, but somehow bigger in others. And as you settle into bed, pulling warm wool blankets up to your chin, you think about your children, the ones you might have someday. They'll grow up in a world where people like you, people who work with their hands and sweat for their bread, actually have a say in how things go. That's not nothing. That's everything, really. Your eyes grow heavy as the village settles into its quiet evening rhythm. Fewer voices than there used to be, but somehow the ones that remain carry more weight. The Black Death took everything, but what it left behind was possibility. Word spreads fast in small villages, especially when it's bad news for the people in charge. By autumn, 3 other peasants in Little Wickham have demanded raises and gotten them. Margaret's hired 2 of her neighbours to help with the merchant business, paying them wages that would have seemed impossible just a few years back. But here's where things get complicated. King Edward's court down in London has been hearing stories about peasants getting uppity, stories about lords paying outrageous wages, stories about the natural order of things getting turned upside down. And the king, well, he's not happy. You hear about it first from a travelling tinker who stops by the village in late October, his cart's loaded with pots and pans, but more importantly, he's loaded with news from the wider world. Parliament's passed a new law, he tells you as you examine a copper pot. Statute of Labourers, they're calling it. Says no worker can demand more than they were paid back in 1346. Before all the dying started. You set the pot down, feeling something cold settle in your stomach. What's that mean exactly? The tinker glances around, making sure no one's listening. Means if they catch you asking for higher wages, they can put you in the stocks, brand your face. Some places, they're hanging folks. The copper pot suddenly feels very heavy in your hands. Course, the tinker continues, lowering his voice. Law's one thing, enforcement's another. Hard to punish a man when you need him to harvest your grain? That night, you lie awake listening to the wind rattle your shutters. The house feels less secure now, less like shelter and more like a target, because that's the thing about progress. It always makes someone angry. Next morning brings frost and bad news. Lord Edmund's steward shows up at your door before sunrise, his face grim as winter soil. His lordship wants to see you, now. The walk to the manor feels different this time, longer, more ominous. The stones under your feet seem to whisper warnings, and your breath comes out in sharp puffs that disappear too quickly in the cold air. Lord Edmund's waiting in the great hall, but he's not alone. 2 men in the king's colours stand beside him, their swords hanging heavy at their sides. Royal commissioners, sent to make sure the new law gets followed. Thomas, Lord Edmund says, his voice carefully neutral. I'm afraid we need to renegotiate our arrangement. One of the commissioners steps forward. He's young, maybe 25, with the kind of soft hands that have never held a plough. By order of King Edward, all wages are hereby returned to their levels of 1346, 2 shillings per week, no more. Your heart pounds, but you keep your voice steady. And if I refuse? The commissioner's hand moves to his sword hilt. Then you'll find yourself explaining your refusal to the king's justice. We have stock set up in the village square and brands heating in the forge. You look at Lord Edmund, searching his face for some sign of support, but he won't meet your eyes. Whatever power you thought you had, it's gone. Just like that. I understand, you say finally, because what else can you say? But as you walk back through the village, you notice something. The other peasants are gathered around the well. Voices low but urgent. Margaret's there too, along with several farmers from neighbouring villages. Word travels fast, and resistance travels faster. They can't just take it back, someone's saying. We're the ones doing the work. We're the ones they need. King or no king, adds another voice. Dead men can't plant grain. You join the circle, feeling the tension crackling like lightning before a storm. These are people who've tasted freedom and they're not eager to give it up. What are you thinking? You ask. Margaret speaks up, her voice carrying an edge you've never heard before. We're thinking maybe it's time the king learned who really keeps this country running. That afternoon, you're working your fields when you see the smoke, 3 columns of it, rising from the direction of Great Wickham, then more from Little Thornton and Wickfield. By evening, the horizon is dotted with orange glows against the darkening sky. Granaries, tax records, manor house outbuildings, nothing that would actually hurt anyone, but everything that would send a message. The revolution has begun. It starts small, like most revolutions do. A tax collector here, a royal commissioner there, finding themselves suddenly unwelcome in villages where they used to command respect. Sometimes it's just cold shoulders and empty houses. Sometimes it's stones thrown from behind hedges. But by winter, it's spreading. You hear stories from travelling merchants, when any merchants are brave enough to travel, peasants in Kent marching on royal castles, workers in Essex refusing to harvest grain for lords who won't pay fair wages, entire villages in Yorkshire simply disappearing, people packing up everything they own and moving to places where they can get better treatment. And the amazing thing, the lords can't stop them. Because stopping a few troublemakers is one thing. Stopping half your remaining workforce is economic suicide. Lord Edmund tries threats first, then bargaining, then something that would have been unthinkable before, begging. Look, he says during another awkward meeting in the Great Hall, I know the commissioners said 2 shillings, but what if we called it 2 shillings plus expenses? Food allowances, extra grain rations. You pretend to consider this, though really you're just enjoying watching a lord squirm. What kind of food allowances? Well, meat twice a week, good bread, ale with dinner. And housing? You can keep the house you're in now. No rent. It's not everything you had before, but it's something, and more importantly, it proves that laws are just words on parchment when reality doesn't cooperate. You shake his hand again, and this time his grip is desperate. Winter settles over the village like a heavy blanket, but it's a restless kind of quiet. Letters arrive at the manor with increasing frequency, carried by nervous messengers who don't stay long, reports from other parts of the kingdom, most of them bad news for anyone wearing a crown. The thing is, when you kill half the population, you don't just lose workers, you lose the social fabric that held everything together, the unquestioned authority, the ancient assumptions about who belongs where, and once people start questioning those assumptions, well, it's hard to get them to stop. Spring brings news of larger uprisings. Not just local disputes over wages, but organised rebellions with leaders and demands and actual armies. Peasants who've decided they're tired of being peasants. The name everyone's talking about is Wat Tyler, a man from Kent who's apparently decided that the king's commissioners can go to hell, along with the king himself. They say he's got 10,000 men, Margaret tells you as you help repair her roof. All of them armed, all of them angry. You hammer another nail into the thatch, thinking about how different everything feels now. Before the plague, 10,000 angry peasants would have been impossible. There wouldn't have been enough discontent, or enough confidence, or enough organisational ability. But after the plague, well, surviving a catastrophe teaches you that the impossible happens all the time. What's he want, you ask? End to serfdom, fair wages, death to corrupt officials. She pauses, then adds quietly, sounds reasonable to me. By early summer, the rebellion's no longer just a story you hear from travellers. It's something you can see on the horizon. Smoke from burning tax offices, streams of refugees fleeing areas where royal armies and peasant militias are fighting running battles. And then, one morning in June, you wake up to find armed men camped in your village square. Not royal soldiers, not exactly, and not local peasants either. Something in between. Men with weathered faces and work-hardened hands, but carrying proper weapons and wearing bits of armour clearly taken from somewhere else. Their leader's a woman, which is shocking enough by itself, but she carries herself like someone used to being obeyed, and when she speaks, people listen. We're heading to London, she announces to the growing crowd, to present our demands to the king. Anyone who wants to come, you're welcome. What demands? Someone calls out. She unfolds a piece of parchment, though you suspect she's memorised every word. End to serfdom and villanage. Fair wages for all workers. Abolition of poll taxes. Punishment for corrupt officials who've grown fat while honest people starve. The crowd murmurs, weighing the risks. Because joining a rebellion is serious business. People get hanged for rebellion. But then again, people have been getting hanged just for asking for fair wages. What makes you think the king will listen? Lord Edmund has appeared, flanked by his remaining guards, but his voice lacks its old authority. He sounds worried. The woman looks at him with something that might be pity. Your lordship, with respect, the king doesn't have much choice. Half his tax collectors are dead or fled. His armies are stretched thin, fighting uprisings from here to Scotland, and winter's coming. If he wants grain harvested and bread baked and roads maintained, he needs us more than we need him. She's right, and everyone knows it. That evening, as the rebels make camp in the common pasture, you find yourself thinking about choices, about the life you've built since the plague, and whether it's worth risking for the chance at something better. Margaret's already decided she's sold her business to a cousin, packed everything she owns into a wagon, and volunteered to help organise supplies for the march to London. You coming? She asks, as you help load her belongings. You look around the village, at the house you've called home, at the fields you've been working, at the life you've slowly, carefully constructed from the ruins of the old world. It's a good life, better than anything your parents could have imagined. But it's also a life that depends on the goodwill of people who would take it away in a heartbeat if they could. Yeah, you say finally, I'm coming. Because here's what you've learned in the years since the plague. Survival isn't just about staying alive. It's about building something worth staying alive for. The next morning, you lock your door, leave a note for Lord Edmund explaining that you've gone to discuss working conditions with the king, and join the line of people heading south toward London, the roads full of others like you, farmers and craftsmen and merchants and labourers, all united by the simple belief that they deserve better than what they're getting. Some carry weapons, others just carry tools, but all of them carry something that would have been impossible before the plague. Hope. The landscape you pass through tells the story of the last 5 years in burned fields and empty villages and manor houses with boarded windows. But it also tells another story in new construction and improved roads and signs of careful, purposeful rebuilding. Because that's the thing about catastrophes. They clear away the old, making room for something new to grow. As you walk, you talk with your fellow travellers, a blacksmith from Essex whose lord tried to cut his wages in half, a miller from Suffolk whose grain stores were seized by royal tax collectors, a weaver from Norfolk whose entire village was burned for refusing to pay a poll tax they couldn't afford. All of them with stories, all of them with grievances, all of them with the same realization that individual resistance isn't enough anymore. By the 3rd day, your group has grown to nearly 1,000 people. By the 5th day, there are rumours of other groups converging on London from all directions, tens of thousands of people, all with the same destination and the same demands. The king's going to have to listen whether he wants to or not. You camp that night on a hilltop overlooking the Thames, and in the distance you can see the smoke and lights of London, the largest city in England, and tomorrow the site of what might be the most important conversation in the kingdom's history. As you settle into your bedroll, listening to the murmur of conversations around the campfire, you think about how far you've come, not just in miles, but in everything else. 5 years ago, you were a serf who couldn't leave your lord's land without permission. Tonight, you're a free man, camped outside the capital, preparing to negotiate with the king as an equal. That's worth something, even if tomorrow goes badly. The stars overhead are the same ones that shone down on the plague years, when bodies filled the streets and the future seemed impossible, but somehow, impossibly, the future arrived anyway, and it looks nothing like what anyone expected. London hits you like a slap to the face. The smell reaches you first, long before you see the city walls. Thousands of people packed together, cooking fires, waste, horses, and underneath it all, something else. Something that makes your stomach clench with memory, fear. You crest the final hill on June 13th, and there it is, the greatest city in England spread out below you like a sprawling beast. Stone walls, church spires, the tower looming over the Thames like a giant's fist, and surrounding it all, camps, thousands upon thousands of people just like you, peasants and craftsmen and labourers who've walked hundreds of miles to have a conversation with a king. Jesus, breathes the blacksmith walking beside you. Look at them all. The camps stretch for miles along the river. Banners flutter in the morning breeze, most of them homemade, bearing symbols you recognise from your own village. The cross of St. George, tools of various trades, and here and there more ominous signs, nooses, headless crowns, slogans painted on rough cloth. Death to traitors. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? Your group finds space on a hillside called Blackheath, where the Kent rebels have gathered under their leader. Wat Tyler's smaller than you expected, maybe 40 years old, with the kind of weathered face that speaks of hard work and harder decisions. But when he talks on more, listen. Brothers, he says, his voice carrying across the camp without strain. Tomorrow we enter the city, not as conquerors, but as free men seeking justice from our king. Cheers rise from the crowd, but Tyler raises his hand for quiet. Remember, we're not here to destroy, we're here to build, to tear down the corrupt system that's kept us in chains and replace it with something fair, something human. You find yourself nodding along, caught up in the hope and energy of the moment. Around you, faces shine with something that's been missing from English villages for too long. Possibility. That night, you barely sleep. The excitement is infectious, crackling through the camp like lightning. People share food, stories, dreams of what comes next. A miller from Canterbury talks about starting a cooperative where workers share the profits. A weaver from Dover imagines guilds run by craftsmen instead of wealthy merchants. But underneath the hope, there's tension. Because everyone knows that what happens in the next few days will determine whether this ends in triumph or massacre. Dawn breaks grey and misty over the Thames, and with it comes movement. Thousands of people breaking camp, gathering belongings, forming loose columns that stretch back toward the horizon. The march to London begins. You walk with Margaret and the blacksmith. Part of a river of humanity flowing toward the city gates. The guards at Aldgate take one look at the approaching crowd and simply step aside. Smart men. London's streets are narrow, twisting, designed for maybe a few hundred people at a time, not several thousand. The crowd spreads out like water finding its level, filling every available space, and the city responds. Some Londoners slam their shutters and bar their doors. Others lean out of windows, cheering, throwing bread and coins. A few brave souls actually join the march. Craftsmen and labourers who've been nursing their own grievances against the wealthy merchants who run the city. But it's when you reach the wealthy quarter that things get interesting. The houses here are different, larger, built of stone instead of timber, with courtyards and gardens and all the signs of lives lived in comfort while others struggled. Someone throws a stone. You're not sure who, but suddenly the air's full of them. Windows shatter, doors splinter, and the crowd. The crowd tastes blood. The Savoy Palace. That's where it really starts. John of Gaunt's residence, the most magnificent building in London after the royal palaces, home to the man who's been the real power behind the throne while young King Richard grows into his crown. Someone shouts, "Burn it," and suddenly everyone's shouting it. You find yourself swept along with the crowd through the palace gates into courtyards filled with treasures that represent more wealth than your entire village sees in a decade. Tapestries, gold plate, furniture carved from exotic woods, and all of it, every bit of it, bought with money squeezed from people who work for a living. The palace burns beautifully. You stand in the courtyard, watching flames lick at windows, feeling the heat on your face and thinking about justice, about balance, about how sometimes the only way to build something new is to burn down what came before. Margaret appears beside you, her face lit by the orange glow. "Feel good?" she asks. "Yeah," you admit. "It does." But even as the palace burns, Tyler's trying to maintain order. You see him moving through the crowd, reminding people that they're here for justice, not revenge. That destroying property is one thing, but harming people is another. Mostly, people listen to him. mostly. The Fleet prison gets opened, and suddenly the streets are full of freed prisoners. Some of them are debtors, people imprisoned for owing money they couldn't pay. Others have been locked up for more serious crimes. Temple Bar burns next, along with all the legal records stored there. Centuries of laws and precedents and property deeds, gone in an afternoon of smoke and celebration. Because here's what the lawyers and lawmakers never understood. When the law serves only the wealthy, burning the law starts to feel like justice. As evening falls, you find yourself with a group of rebels surrounding the Tower of London, the ancient fortress where kings have lived and died, where traitors have been executed, where the machinery of royal power grinds on regardless of who suffers beneath it. And inside, trembling behind stone walls that suddenly don't seem so impregnable, is 14-year-old King Richard himself. "Come out," someone shouts. "Come out and face your people." But the tower stays silent, its gates locked, its guards nowhere to be seen. Tyler arrives with a message. The king, through intermediaries, has agreed to meet tomorrow morning at Mile End, outside the city walls, a place where both sides can gather safely. He's agreed to hear our demands, Tyler announces. All of them. Freedom from serfdom, fair wages, punishment for corrupt officials. The crowd erupts in cheers. But you notice Tyler's expression remains careful. Hopeful, but careful. Because promising to listen and actually listening are two very different things. That night, you sleep in the ruins of a tax collector's office, the papers and ledgers that once recorded every penny owed by every peasant in 3 counties. They make excellent kindling for your campfire. Outside, London burns in a dozen places, not the whole city, but enough to send a message that can be seen for miles. The old order is ending. What comes next? That's tomorrow's question. Morning arrives with the sound of trumpets, royal trumpets, calling from the direction of Mile End. King Richard, apparently, is ready to talk. The march out of the city is different from the march in, more organised, more purposeful. Tyler's managed to impose something like discipline on the crowd, arranging them in rough columns with representatives from different regions. You walk with the Essex group, maybe 2,000 strong, carrying banners that list your specific grievances. End to serfdom. Abolition of poll taxes, fair courts, the right to hunt in royal forests. Simple things, really, human things. Mile End is a large field outside London's walls, perfect for the kind of massive gathering that's about to take place. And there, waiting on a raised platform surrounded by guards and nobles, is the king himself, Richard Plantagenet, 14 years old, heir to Edward the Black Prince, ruler of England, though right now he looks more like a scared boy trying very hard to appear brave, which, to be fair, he probably is. The meeting begins with ceremony, heralds reading proclamations, nobles making speeches about royal mercy and divine authority. But Tyler cuts through all of it with the kind of blunt speaking that makes lawyers nervous. "Your Majesty," he says, stepping forward, "we've come to discuss the terms under which your people, all your people, can live with dignity." Richard's voice is higher than you expected, still changing, but it carries clearly across the field. "We are prepared to hear your concerns." What follows is the most extraordinary conversation in English history, a king negotiating with peasants as equals. Tyler presents the demands, one by one: end to serfdom and villanage, freedom for all bondmen, reduction of rents to reasonable levels, amnesty for all rebels, charters guaranteeing these rights in perpetuity. And Richard, young, scared, but apparently well advised, agrees to all of it. Every single demand. The crowd erupts. People weep, embrace, fall to their knees in gratitude. You find yourself shaking, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what just happened. Serfdom ended. Just like that, with words on parchment and a royal seal, scribes begin copying charters immediately, documents that will be carried back to every village and town, proof that the old system is dead and something new has been born. You're handed a charter, the parchment still wet with ink, bearing the royal seal that makes it law. Freedom, spelled out in Latin and English, official as sunrise. Margaret's crying, and you realise you are too. But even as the celebration begins, you notice something. Tyler's not celebrating. He's watching the king and the nobles around him with the careful attention of a man who knows that promises made under pressure are easily broken once the pressure's gone. And he's right to be careful, because while this meeting's happening, while charters are being written and hands are being shaken, other things are happening too. A group of rebels, frustrated by the slow pace of negotiation, has decided to take more direct action. They've stormed the Tower of London, overwhelming the guards, searching for the men they hold responsible for years of oppression. Simon Sudbury, Archbishop of Canterbury and Chancellor of England, the man who blessed the poll taxes and defended the old system. Robert Hales, Treasurer of England, the man who collected those taxes and filled the royal coffers while peasants starved. John Leger, the bureaucrat who designed the whole system of oppression. They find all three, drag them from their hiding places, and execute them on Tower Hill. The news reaches Mile End just as the charter ceremony is ending, carried by a breathless messenger who can barely get the words out. The tower's taken. The traitors are dead. Sudbury's head's on a spike. The celebration turns darker, more urgent, because this changes everything. There's no going back now, no pretending this was just a peaceful petition for redress of grievances. This is revolution, complete and bloody. Richard's face goes white, but to his credit, he doesn't flee. Instead, he asks for another meeting, tomorrow, at Smithfield, to discuss additional concerns. Tyler agrees, though you can see the calculation in his eyes. He knows the game has changed, knows that executing royal officials makes this a different kind of negotiation entirely. That night, camped again outside London, the mood is strange, jubilant and terrified in equal measure, because everyone understands that they've crossed a line. There's no peaceful resolution anymore. Either the rebellion succeeds completely or it fails catastrophically. No middle ground. You lie awake, listening to the murmur of conversations around the camp, thinking about the charter folded carefully in your pack, freedom, written in royal ink on royal parchment, but also thinking about the heads on pikes at the tower, and what they mean for anyone who's taken part in putting them there. Tomorrow's meeting at Smithfield will determine whether you go home as free men or whether you die as traitors, and honestly, you're not sure which is more likely. The stars overhead are the same ones that shone down on your village back when this all started with a simple request for fair wages, but somehow, impossibly, that simple request has become something much larger, a demand that England itself change or burn in the attempt. Either way, there's no going back to the way things were. The old world died with the plague, and tomorrow you'll find out whether the new world gets to live. Smithfield feels different. Where Mile End had been open, welcoming, a place where equals could meet and talk, Smithfield feels like a trap. It's smaller, more enclosed, with too many places for armed men to hide. You notice these things now, after a week of revolution. Your eyes have learned to see threats, to calculate distances to exits, to recognise the difference between a nervous guard and a dangerous one. The king arrives with more soldiers this time, a lot more. They ring the field in neat formations, supposedly for protection, but you can't shake the feeling they're there for a different kind of protection entirely. Richard looks different too, less like a scared boy, more like someone who spent the night getting advice from people who know how to deal with troublesome peasants. Wat Tyler steps forward, and you can see the tension in his shoulders. He knows this isn't going to go like yesterday's meeting, but he's committed now, too far in to back down. Your Majesty, Tyler begins, we've come to discuss additional terms, but Richard cuts him off. The terms discussed yesterday are sufficient. We suggest you return to your homes and trouble us no more. The words hit the crowd like a physical blow. Yesterday's promises, suddenly conditional, suddenly negotiable. Tyler's voice hardens. With respect, Your Majesty, those terms didn't address everything. We need guarantees, real guarantees, and we need them in writing, with penalties for anyone who tries to reverse them. You need, Richard's voice carries a new edge. You forget yourself, Tyler. We are your king. You do not make demands of us. The crowd behind you stirs, restless, sensing the shift in mood. Yesterday they were citizens petitioning their ruler. Today, they're rebels facing judgment. Tyler takes another step forward, close enough now that you can see the sweat on his face despite the cool morning air. Your Majesty, we're reasonable men. We've shed blood for what's right. We won't go home empty-handed. Blood, Richard's voice rises. You speak of blood. You murdered our Chancellor, our Treasurer, men who served the crown faithfully. Men who served themselves, Tyler shoots back, while honest people starved. The space between them crackles with tension. Two men representing two completely different ideas about how the world should work, and around them, thousands of people waiting to see which idea wins. That's when it happens. Tyler, frustrated by the king's sudden coldness, makes a gesture. Maybe he's reaching for his sword. Maybe he's just emphasizing a point. Maybe he's trying to demonstrate something. It doesn't matter. William Walworth, Lord Mayor of London, sees Tyler's hand move toward his weapon and decides he's seen enough. His sword comes out in one smooth motion, catching Tyler in the neck before anyone can react. Tyler staggers, blood spraying, his eyes wide with shock. He takes two more steps, reaches out toward the king as if to say something, and collapses, dead. Just like that, the silence stretches for maybe 3 heartbeats, long enough for everyone to understand what just happened. Then, chaos. The crowd surges forward, screaming for vengeance. Swords come out, bows are drawn. The careful discipline Tyler had imposed, gone in an instant. And that's when Richard does something extraordinary. He spurs his horse forward, directly into the mob, his young voice cutting through the screaming. "You shall have no captain but me!" The words are perfectly chosen, perfectly timed, because these aren't anarchists or criminals. They're people who still believe in kingship, who still think their grievances can be addressed by appealing to royal justice. And here's their king, young and brave and apparently sympathetic, offering to be their leader. The crowd, incredibly, actually stops. "Follow me," Richard continues, his voice gaining strength. "I will be your king and your captain. Your grievances shall be heard. Justice shall be done." It's brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. Because instead of facing an angry mob seeking revenge for their murdered leader, he's created a situation where he's leading that mob, where their anger becomes his to direct. The crowd follows him away from Smithfield, away from Tyler's body, to an open field where they can be properly surrounded by royal troops. And once they're there, once they're isolated and outnumbered, Richard's true intentions become clear. "Men of Essex, Kent and Suffolk," he announces, his voice now carrying total authority. "You have been deceived, led astray by traitors and rebels, but we are merciful. Return to your homes now, and we will forgive your momentary confusion." The crowd murmurs, uncertain. Some of the rebels are nodding, ready to accept the offer. Others look suspicious, sensing the trap. "What about the charters?" someone calls out. "What about our freedom?" Richard's smile doesn't reach his eyes. Those agreements were made under duress. Contracts signed with a sword at one's throat have no legal standing. And there it is. The betrayal, complete and final. You feel something cold settle in your stomach as the full magnitude of the situation becomes clear. There's no going home as free men. There's no peaceful resolution. There's only whatever comes next. Some of the rebels break and run immediately, scattering toward the edges of the field. Others try to maintain formation, to negotiate, to salvage something from the wreckage. But the royal troops are already moving, surrounding groups of rebels, separating leaders from followers, beginning the systematic process of turning a political uprising into a criminal conspiracy. You grab Margaret's hand. "We need to go, now." "What about the others?" "The others are finished. We stay. We're finished too." You slip away during the confusion, moving toward the edge of the field where the encirclement isn't quite complete yet. Behind you, you can hear shouting, the clash of weapons, the sound of a revolution dying in real time. The journey home takes 2 weeks. 2 weeks of travelling at night, hiding during the day, avoiding main roads where royal patrols might be hunting for rebels. The countryside tells the story of the crackdown, smoke rising from villages that supported the rebellion, bodies hanging from trees along major roads, burned farmhouses belonging to families whose men marched to London. King Richard, it turns out, is very good at holding grudges. You reach Little Wickham on a grey morning in early July and find a village transformed. Royal commissioners have been through, asking questions, taking names, making lists. Lord Edmund greets you at the manor house, but not with relief, with cold calculation. "Thomas," he says, looking you up and down like he's evaluating livestock, "I hear you've been travelling." "Aye, my lord, just visiting family." "Family in London, was it?" The question hangs in the air between you, because everyone knows where you've been, everyone knows what you've done. The only question is whether Lord Edmund intends to do anything about it. "I've been asked," he continues slowly, "to provide names of men from this village who might have participated in recent disturbances." Your mouth goes dry. And I've told them that my workers were here the entire time, helping with the harvest, far too busy to go gallivanting off to London. Relief floods through you, but it comes with a price tag attached. "Of course," Lord Edmund adds, "busy workers deserve appropriate compensation. I'm thinking 18 pence a week. No more requests for raises, no more negotiations. Take it or find yourself explaining to the King's Justice why you happen to be away from the village during the recent unpleasantness." 18 pence, less than you were making before the rebellion, less than you'd negotiated after the plague, but more than nothing, which is what you'll get if you're hanged as a traitor. 18 pence sounds fair, you say, because what choice do you have? The months that follow are quiet. Dangerously quiet. The kind of quiet that comes when people are afraid to talk, afraid to complain, afraid to do anything that might bring unwanted attention. The rebellion's leaders are hunted down systematically. Some are executed publicly, their heads displayed on spikes as warnings. Others simply disappear, their fate left to imagination. The promises made at Mile End, forgotten. The charters guaranteeing freedom declared null and void. The end of serfdom postponed indefinitely. On the surface, it's as if the rebellion never happened. But underneath, things have changed in ways that can't be undone. Because here's the thing about revolutions, even failed ones, they change how people think about themselves, about their place in the world, about what's possible. You work Lord Edmund's fields, but you don't work them the same way. There's a sullenness to it now, a resentment that wasn't there before. You do what's required, but no more. And when opportunities arise to cause small problems, equipment that breaks at inconvenient times, grain that somehow gets spilled, work that takes longer than it should, well, accidents happen. Other villages are experiencing similar accidents. Productivity drops across the kingdom, not dramatically but enough to be noticed, enough to matter. And the royal treasury, despite the crackdown, continues to struggle because dead peasants don't pay taxes, fled workers don't harvest grain, and sullen, resentful labourers don't work as hard as motivated ones. Winter brings news from London. Parliament's abandoned attempts to collect poll taxes, too expensive to enforce, too dangerous to pursue. The rebellion failed, but its central demand, the thing that started all the trouble, has quietly been achieved. Small victories. By spring, subtle changes are spreading through the kingdom. Lords are offering better terms to keep workers from fleeing. The church is preaching less about obedience and more about justice. Merchants are hiring workers at wages that would have been unthinkable just a few years back. Not because anyone changed their minds about the natural order of things, but because the natural order, after the plague, after the rebellion, simply doesn't work anymore. Margaret's doing well. She's opened a new shop in the next village over, buying and selling goods for travellers. Business is good, partly because she's smart, partly because she's one of the few people left with enough capital to take advantage of opportunities. Funny how things work out, she says one evening as you share ale by her fireplace. All that fighting, all that dying, and in the end, we got most of what we wanted anyway. Did we? Look around. You're paying lower rent than before the rebellion. I'm running my own business. The poll tax is gone. Lords are competing for workers instead of the other way around. She's right, in a way. The rebellion failed, but the world it was fighting for? That world arrived anyway. Slowly, quietly. Through 1,000 small adjustments and compromises, because that's how real change usually happens. Not through grand gestures and dramatic confrontations, but through the steady, persistent pressure of people who refuse to accept the unacceptable. You think about Wat Tyler sometimes, lying in the dirt at Smithfield, blood pooling around his head. He died for nothing and everything. The immediate cause was lost, but the deeper cause, the thing he was really fighting for, that survived. Freedom isn't just a word on parchment, it's a way of thinking, a refusal to accept that some people matter more than others just because of where they were born. And once that idea gets loose in the world, it's very hard to put back in the bottle. Outside Margaret's window, you can see lights in houses across the village, people living their lives, making their choices, building their futures, not as serfs or bondmen, but as free people who happen to be poor. That's not nothing, that's actually everything. The plague took half the population of Europe. The rebellion that followed took hundreds more lives. But what emerged from all that death, what crawled out of the wreckage of the old world, was something unprecedented, a society where ordinary people had choices, where someone born in a hovel could end up owning land, where a widow could run a business, where a peasant could tell a lord no and live to talk about it. It wasn't the world Tyler dreamed of, but it was closer to that dream than anyone thought possible. Back when the dying started and the future seemed impossible, change comes slowly, then all at once, and sometimes, if you're very lucky, you get to live through the moment when everything shifts, when the old assumptions crumble, when new possibilities suddenly seem real. The Black Death was the worst thing that ever happened to medieval Europe, but what came after, what grew from the soil, fertilized by all that death, was the beginning of the modern world, a world where people like you matter, where your voice counts, where the future belongs to everyone. Not just the people born wealthy enough to own it. That's worth remembering as you drift off to sleep in a house you choose to live in, earning wages you helped negotiate, in a village where you're free to stay or go as you please. The revolution failed, but somehow, impossibly, you won anyway. Time has a funny way of healing wounds you thought would never close. It's been 15 years since the rebellion, 15 years since Wat Tyler died in the dirt at Smithfield, 15 years since you walked home from London with a price on your head and revolution in your heart. Now, you're 43 years old, you own your house outright, your fields produce enough grain to feed your family and sell at market. Your oldest son is learning to read, something that would have been impossible for someone of your class before the plague changed everything. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the work is done and the village settles into its peaceful rhythm, you almost forget how the world used to be. Almost. But then something happens to remind you. A letter arrives from a cousin in Venice, or a merchant passes through with stories from France, or you catch sight of one of those strange new doctors walking through the countryside wearing their peculiar bird-like masks. And you remember that the changes, the real changes, are still spreading like ripples in a pond. The Venetians, clever bastards that they are, figured something out that nobody else had. They realized the plague wasn't just God's wrath or bad air or punishment for sin. It was something specific, something that traveled from person to person, from place to place, in ways you could predict and maybe control. So they did something radical. They built hospitals, not for treating people. There still wasn't much anyone could do for someone with the plague, but for keeping sick people away from healthy ones. Islands in their lagoon, dedicated entirely to isolation and quarantine. Quarantainer, 40 days. That's how long they figured it took to know whether someone was going to live or die. The idea spread slowly at first, then faster as people realized it actually worked. Florence built lazarettos, Milan created quarantine houses, cities across Europe started treating disease like something you could fight instead of just endure. It was revolutionary in its own quiet way. because it meant people weren't just helpless victims anymore. They could take action, make choices, protect themselves and their families through knowledge and planning instead of prayer and hope. That changes how you think about everything. Your youngest daughter, born 5 years after the rebellion, has grown up in a world where diseases have causes, where doctors wear special clothes and carry medicines that sometimes actually work, where the arrival of plague in a neighbouring city means quarantine and precautions. Not just resignation to God's will, she expects the world to make sense, expects problems to have solutions, expects authority figures to justify their decisions instead of just demanding obedience. That's not how children thought before the plague, before the rebellion, before everything changed. Margaret's grandson is apprenticed to a painter now, not just any painter, but one of those new artists who've been emerging from the Italian cities, people who paint what they actually see instead of what religious authorities tell them they should see. It started with the plague, all this new thinking. When you've watched half your neighbours die for no reason, anyone can explain. When you've seen the most pious people suffer alongside the worst sinners, when you've buried children who never hurt anyone, well, it makes you question some assumptions about divine justice, about the natural order, about whether the people in charge actually know what they're talking about. The painters, the writers, the scholars, they're asking different questions now. Instead of, what does the church say about this? They're asking, what do we actually see? What can we prove? What makes sense? It's dangerous thinking, revolutionary thinking, and it's spreading. You see it in small ways, daily ways. The village priest still gives sermons about obedience and accepting your station in life, but fewer people nod along. More folks ask awkward questions about why God would let good people suffer while corrupt officials prosper. The manor house still dominates the landscape, but Lord Edmund spends more time negotiating with workers than commanding them, because he learned the hard way that people who don't want to work for you can usually find someone else who'll treat them better. The royal tax collectors still come around, but they're polite about it now, almost apologetic, because everyone remembers what happened the last time they got too aggressive about collecting money from people who couldn't afford to pay. Power, real power, has shifted in ways that are hard to see but impossible to ignore, from the top down to the bottom, from those who own to those who work, from tradition to innovation. You're seeing the birth of something entirely new, a world where ordinary people matter, where individual lives have value beyond their usefulness to wealthy landowners, where someone born in poverty might die in comfort. Not everyone, of course, not yet, probably not ever, but enough people for it to feel possible, and possibility, once people taste it, is addictive. Your son wants to be a lawyer. Can you imagine a peasant's son arguing cases in court, interpreting law, maybe even writing new laws? Before the plague, before the rebellion, before everything shifted, that would have been unthinkable. Now, well, stranger things have happened. The universities are different too. Still exclusive, still expensive, but no longer quite as rigid about who gets to attend. Scholarship students from merchant families, bright young men whose fathers work with their hands instead of inherited wealth. Knowledge, slowly, is becoming less of a monopoly. Books are still rare, still precious, but there are more of them than there used to be. Copying manuscripts is faster now, more efficient, and the topics, they're broader, less focused on religious doctrine, and more interested in practical things, medicine, engineering, astronomy, agriculture, how to actually solve problems instead of just explaining why God allows them to exist. You've learned to read a little yourself. Not much, but enough to puzzle through contracts and legal documents. Enough to know when someone's trying to cheat you with fancy language. Knowledge is power, and power, even a little bit, changes everything. The roads are better maintained now. Not because the king ordered it, but because merchants and travellers demanded it, because people who can afford to travel want safe, reliable routes, because local communities realised they could tax road usage and fund improvements themselves. Self-interest, properly organised, turns out to be a powerful force for positive change. Who knew? The markets are livelier too. More goods, more choices, more competition between sellers, which means better prices for buyers, better wages for workers, better opportunities for anyone clever enough to spot them. Margaret's doing very well indeed. Her trading business now spans 3 counties, dealing in everything from grain to metalwork to exotic spices from places you can't pronounce. She employs 12 people, pays them fair wages, and somehow still manages to turn a healthy profit. The secret, she tells you over wine that's considerably better than the ale you used to share, is treating workers like partners instead of property. Happy people work harder, satisfied customers come back, honest dealing builds reputations, and reputation builds wealth. Revolutionary thinking, but it works. The village itself has grown, not back to its pre-plague size, that'll probably never happen, but new families have moved in, younger people looking for opportunities, craftsmen attracted by the prospect of affordable land and lower taxes, new blood. New ideas, new ways of doing things. The church is different too. Father Michael still preaches on Sundays, but his sermons focus more on compassion and community service, less on obedience and eternal damnation. He's learned that people who've survived catastrophe want practical guidance, not threats about theoretical punishment. Plus, he needs the congregation's support more than they need his approval. Empty churches don't collect tithes. Even God's representatives have to adapt to new realities. But perhaps the most remarkable change, the one that would have been impossible to imagine 30 years ago, is how people think about the future. Before the plague, the future was predetermined. Fixed. You were born into a station in life and you died in the same station. Your children inherited your social position along with your debts. Progress was measured in generations, if it happened at all. Now people make plans, set goals, imagine their children living better lives than they did, believe that hard work and clever thinking can actually change outcomes. Hope, it turns out, is contagious. Your oldest daughter is married to a blacksmith's son who's saving money to open his own shop. Your middle son works as a clerk for a wool merchant, learning the business, planning to eventually start his own trading company. Your youngest wants to study medicine, to become one of those new doctors who actually heal people instead of just blessing them. 3 children, 3 different paths, all of them leading upward. That's not luck, that's not accident, that's the direct result of living in a world where social mobility, while still difficult, is at least possible. The Black Death created that world, not intentionally, not kindly, but definitively. By killing so many people, it broke the rigid social structures that had kept everyone locked in place for centuries. By creating labour shortages, it gave ordinary workers bargaining power they'd never had before. By demonstrating that traditional authority couldn't protect anyone from catastrophe, it opened space for new kinds of thinking. The price was horrific. 25 million dead in Europe alone, families destroyed, communities wiped out, an entire generation traumatized by losses too great to comprehend. But from that trauma, somehow, emerged something unprecedented, a society where individual merit mattered more than inherited status, where innovation was valued alongside tradition, where people could question authority without facing immediate execution, the foundation, in other words, of the modern world. Not that anyone planned it that way. History rarely works according to plan. Usually, it stumbles forward through a combination of catastrophe and adaptation, crisis and opportunity, blind luck and stubborn human determination to survive. The plague was the catastrophe, the rebellion was the crisis. What came after, what you're living through now, is the adaptation, and it's remarkable. You're sitting by your fireplace on a winter evening in 1398, watching your youngest daughter practice writing by candlelight. Her letters are neat, careful, better than your own halting attempts at literacy. She's writing a letter to her cousin in London, describing life in the village, sharing news and gossip and plans for the future. Ordinary correspondence between ordinary people, except that 30 years ago, ordinary people couldn't write letters. Because they couldn't write, because they had no one to correspond with, because their lives were too narrow and constrained to generate news worth sharing. Now, your daughter's life is full of possibilities. School if she's smart enough, marriage if she finds the right partner, business if she's ambitious enough, travel if she's adventurous enough, freedom not unlimited but real. That's the plague's strangest legacy, not the millions of deaths, though those are remembered, not the economic disruption, though that's still being felt, but the simple fact that people now expect their lives to matter, expect their voices to be heard, expect their work to be valued, expect their children to have opportunities. Expectations, once raised, are hard to lower. Outside your window, the village sleeps peacefully under a blanket of snow. Smoke rises from chimneys. Dogs bark in the distance. Someone's playing a lute badly but enthusiastically. Normal sounds. Comfortable sounds. The sounds of people living their lives without fear of sudden catastrophe or arbitrary punishment. It took 30 years, but somehow, impossibly, normal came back. Different than before, better in many ways, but recognizably, blessedly, normal. The plague taught Europe that catastrophe was always possible. The rebellion taught it that change was always possible too. And what emerged from those lessons was a new kind of society, one built on the revolutionary idea that ordinary people deserved ordinary happiness. Not much to ask for when you think about it. Food on the table, a roof overhead, work that pays fairly, children who might live better lives than their parents, basic human dignity. But for most of human history, even that much was too much to hope for. Now, it's the minimum people expect. That's actually extraordinary. You bank the fire and prepare for bed, checking that the doors are latched, that the windows are shuttered against the cold. Small precautions against predictable problems, the kind of ordinary vigilance that's possible when you're not constantly watching for plague or famine or violent social upheaval. When the world makes enough sense that planning ahead actually works. Your bed is warm, the blankets are wool, well made, purchased rather than inherited. Your house is solid, properly constructed, chosen rather than assigned. These aren't luxuries, exactly, but they're comforts, signs of a life lived with some degree of control over circumstances. As you settle into sleep, you think about tomorrow, market day in the next village, you'll sell grain, buy supplies, maybe stop by the inn for ale and conversation with other farmers. Ordinary plans, normal expectations, the kind of boring day-to-day existence that's only possible when society isn't collapsing around your ears. The Black Death ended 50 years ago. The rebellion failed 30 years ago. But somehow, the world they left behind became the world you always hoped for. Not perfect, not equal, not fair in any absolute sense, but better, measurably, undeniably better. And that, as you drift off to sleep in a house you own, in a bed you chose, in a life you built through your own decisions and efforts, that's enough. More than enough. It's everything, really. The future, whatever it brings, belongs to people like you now. People who work for a living, people who think for themselves, people who expect tomorrow to be at least as good as today and are willing to work to make it happen. That's the Black Death's most unexpected gift. Not the ending it brought, but the beginning it made possible. The beginning of a world where ordinary people matter, where you matter, where your story, this story, becomes part of something larger than any individual life, but made meaningful by the sum of all individual choices. Sleep comes easily in such a world. Dream peacefully in such a time. Tomorrow will be better. Not perfect, but better. And that's revolution enough for anyone.